So good morning, everybody. Get some coffee in you. If anybody's feeling tired, I set my alarm for the wrong time, and I got a huge shot of adrenaline when I got a direct message from Grant reminding me to come down for the keynote. So I recommend that. Just everybody have Grant send you a DM to, wake you up. So I'm Pete Skomoroch. I'm a principal data scientist at LinkedIn. And I'm one of the early data scientists. When I started at LinkedIn, the term data scientist didn't exist. I was hired as a senior research scientist, and this field emerged over time. I've been there about 3.5 years now. And what I'm going to talk to you today about is really kind of at this intersection of search and data science. Hillary Mason gave a keynote yesterday talking a little bit more about data science and search. What I'm really going to talk about is skills, reputation, and search. So LinkedIn is in the professional domain, and so skills, and Grant had a great blog post recently about, can we stop using the term unstructured data? Right? Because text really has this deep and rich structure that is in some ways much more complex than data that is numerical and that we stuff in columns and rows. So I'm going to talk. I'm going to give you a sense of how to grow that data, because it's not just the case that you have a bunch of data and then you index it and serve it to users. It's often the case that these things are intertwined, right? You may need additional data to improve the relevance of your search, right? And to improve recall, and you want to be serving up the right information to your customers and to your members. The other theme that I'm going to hit on a bit in this talk is reputation, right? So especially in the area of people search, reputation is important, and I think that this is another theme, a bigger theme that we're seeing in the world of data right now. There was a great article in New York Times the other day called something like it's the 401k world, and what it was getting at was this idea that everything that we're doing is being measured and quantified more, and there's this whole movement of quantified self and tracking your health and using apps like Runkeeper and things like that. In an interesting way, I was talking to someone the other night here over beers, and I think that open source, so we just heard a lot about the great open source community that Lucene and Solar have. And when I think about open source, I think about that community, and it's great because you can contribute. If there's a bug, you can fix it. Another interesting aspect of that, of open source, is that reputation is there. It's measured, right? Your commits, your activity, how helpful you are on the mailing list. And really what I think you're seeing is that this open source movement is now transforming other parts of society, right? So as open source moves into government and moves into other industries, people are adopting some of these ideas and transforming the way that they work, right? So reporters now, which hadn't been a super quantitative discipline, are emailing around data on their most emailed stories, right? So in a way, that's like tracking, your lines of code and your commits. How are you actually doing in your job? And that really gets at the heart of the other theme in the talk, which is transforming the world of work and creating economic opportunity. So let me dial back up a little further and talk about that world of opportunity. So our vision at LinkedIn is to create economic opportunity for every professional in the world, right? So that's a pretty bold vision. And the way that we're thinking about that is, imagine, so everybody's familiar with the concept of a social network, right? So LinkedIn is a professional network, and it has that professional focus and context. And really this vision of creating economic opportunity, what would that look like? Well, imagine if you had an economic graph which connected people, companies, jobs, skills, education, All of these things are nodes in this graph. And opportunities, as they emerge, can be connected nearly instantly with the right people to fill them or the right skills to fill them. And having that frictionless, making the transitions in that graph frictionless and connecting people with opportunity is really where we'd like to see the world. So how do we do that? Well, our mission, our concrete objective is to connect the world's professionals to make them more productive and successful. And a key strategy is to become the professional profile of record. And we have over 200 million member profiles on our site. And each of those profiles, it's not just a static document, right? So like Grant was saying about, let's stop talking about unstructured data. This is a mix of rich elements, including more structured text data like companies. We have specific fields for skills, for companies, for your job title. And then we also overlay on that a lot of additional information that's more graph-based. So who are your connections? Who did you go to school with? Your alumni, your peers, your coworkers. Data about skills and endorsements. How many people in this room have been endorsed for skills on LinkedIn? Okay, so that's just about every hand. So that's a product that originally was the first thing that I started thinking about when I got to LinkedIn. So at the time, skills didn't exist. We had data around companies and titles and education, and we had some text fields around specialties. And Yannick was talking about kind of a dream job. So for me to walk in and have Hadoop and have the infrastructure really in place to dig into these kinds of problems, this is a dream job for a data scientist. And I'd done some work in search at AOL in the past, back in 2006, working with Nutch and Lucene. And I'd really gotten going over the previous 2 years with Hadoop. And this was really the first time that I got to dig deeply into such a large data set and leverage the potential of these platforms. So that leads to the other key strategic objective here, which is around search, right? So how do we connect talent with opportunity? Search is a key, right? So you should be able to search for any job, any opportunity, any person, and find the right fit and the right match for your objective. And we're Lucene based. Asif, who's out here in the crowd, if you want to talk to him later about the details on where we're going with that and what we're working on. We've got a great team that's leveraging Lucene, and not just for the user-facing pieces that you see, but also in the back end in some interesting ways to do machine learning. So really what we're doing is taking all this rich data, growing that data to build that graph, and then doing some really smart stuff on the text data and graph data combined to understand reputation and to understand relevance. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you were looking for a mobile developer or a Ruby developer or in this case a data scientist, what does it mean to find a relevant data scientist, to find the right person for that role? Well, what you see here, based on all this data that's flowing through our system, we can see what skills are actually correlated with the title data scientist. So at this point, I think it's probably in the tens of thousands of people who are listing this as an actual title on their profile. And the phrases you're seeing here, machine learning, natural language processing, data mining, text mining, you can think of this as this is a vector of what's most correlated with that role. And if I was looking for a data scientist, how can you think about reputation and relevance? If you have someone who's really top-notch in machine learning and top-notch in text mining and information retrieval, and they can use Hadoop, then they're probably pretty relevant to your search, right? So you can think about breaking down any particular role into a set of topics or strengths and abilities. And if you can quantify and measure how good a candidate is in those areas, then that's a really a quantitative, data-driven way to sift through all that information, right, of those 200 million people. So another key element here is understanding the relationship between these concepts, right? So if you have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of topics, how do they relate to each other, right? What are synonyms? What structure? What rich structure is there in this text data? So here you see I've zoned in using Gephi, which is, one of our the co-founders of Gephi is on our data science team, Matthew Bastian. So he generated this, and he can zoom in on big data, and you can see what are the other concepts nearby. So this is pretty, but really what it's doing is just illustrating what's happening underneath the covers. So when I do a search for big data, if you have that context of, well, what are the other related terms, and how important are they, then even if I don't list big data on my profile, but I list Voldemort and data science, then you can guess that I'm probably working in the field of big data. So for each of those topics, we can go even deeper and we can say, well, how does it relate to all these other entities that we understand? So information retrieval was one of the nodes on that graph. We can see what are all the related topics or skills, text classification, text mining, natural language are things that come up. We can map it to Wikipedia, and I'll talk a little bit about how we did that. We can gather this set of people. According to this, it looks like there's over 30,000 people who list information retrieval on their profile. We can actually get that graph of people and look at social reputation signals and other signals to surface the most relevant people. In this case, Peter Norvig, who's research director at Google, Andrew McCollum, who's a big person in this field, and really extract out who are the key nodes based on a combination of text and graph data. And then we can also surface companies as another example. So we can say, okay, Google, Microsoft, Yandex, these are all big players in information retrieval. And this is all done not by a human, but by algorithms, right? Which I think is the real power. The same thing for that data science skills slide. Rather than debate and have a human come up with this, we can do it in an automatic way. So this, as I said, there's hundreds of thousands of these topics. So you have information retrieval. You also have people specializing in things like SoulRetrieval. So this is one of my favorite skills. So and it looks like this is in the less than 1,000 people. But if you're looking for SoulRetrieval, they're on there. Now, similarly, just like there's this big data graph, there's this whole SoulRetrieval graph where we can see what other skills people have who know SoulRetrieval, past life regression, psychic readings, spirituality, energy healing. So what I'm trying to capture here is that this isn't as simple as putting a few people in a room and understanding technical jargon in one particular domain. There's tens of thousands of different areas that get very rich and complex that we probably don't know about, right, as technical people. So another one of those areas which people in this room do know about is leucine. And so this is a page, if you search on LinkedIn for leucine, you'll get a recommendation for a skill page. You can click and see this. And really what we're doing here is just surfacing some of this rich metadata that we're able to generate, again, using Hadoop, and surface to members. And really that's a key strategy, is surfacing this data was a first step so that behind the scenes we can start to improve it and build it into our search index. So who do we see here? There's probably some of these people are in the room. There's Yannick, Doug, Otis, and related companies. We got LucidWorks up there, Apache Foundation, LinkedIn. So for someone who's getting into leucine, this is a quick resource and a quick way to see what's involved and what skills people have in new leucine. But really that centerpiece of the people, that's really the heart of what we're getting at, is then leveraging this data and leveraging skill data in search. So I asked how many people were endorsed. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that and reputation and what that's all about. So one question is, okay, well, how are we surfacing those people on that list? There's over 14,000 people listing leucine on their profiles. We take that graph of people, and then we look at these both text and graph signals and how those people relate to each other and look into that community. Imagine looking at the leucine mailing list, for example. So here, what you see is the core of that graph on LinkedIn, and we see people like Ted Dunning, Doug Cutting, Grant, Yannick is there in the core, and we can see all these reputation signals. All these people are endorsing each other. They're connecting to each other on LinkedIn. They may have worked together in the past. They may list projects that they work together on. So really, that's the power, and that's the way we're thinking about it, is take kind of what you're doing in open source and building that community and quantifying it for the rest of the professional world. So here's Solar, similar set of people, similar set of companies, a little bit different. We see for Solar, we've got Grant again. We have Eric up at the top. And again, this is very just directional to give you a sense of what's going on here. As we build in more signals and as we gather more data, this is really going to be a powerful way to think about any particular topic. So how are we building this graph? And this is really at the heart of what I think will be useful for people to take back and to take away. Keep in mind, we started with profiles without this data as a structured field. And we want people to adopt and add that information to their profile so that they can find each other and be found. Beyond that, we're tapping into something here which is a deeper desire to validate others and to be validated yourself, right? So that's a key element here. Really behind endorsements, we're giving people the opportunity to express what the endorsements of their peers and to give back to people, kind of like a +1 on a commit or a mailing list. So what you see here, this is an example of someone's profile. Each of those topics that they're strong in, they've added as a skill or an area of expertise, and they have a set of people from their network who've endorsed them, right? So if I look at this person's profile, I can see, okay, they've got 73 endorsements for Hadoop, 62 for distributed systems. So it gives me at a glance a sense of what they're doing. Now, I wouldn't worry too much about the number of scores here. It's not just the number of upvotes that you get, it's the nature, right? If Doug Cutting endorses you for Leucine or for Hadoop, that carries a lot of weight, right? The other thing to note here is that this is what we call a data product or a data feature, skill endorsements on LinkedIn. It grew rapidly, right? So we had viral growth when we hit over 1 billion endorsements within 5 months. And you can imagine in terms of data growth for the index, that's an amazingly rich data set, which can get us further towards our mission. So how did we actually do that, right? So we built these features into the UI and into the site, but how did we actually amplify and grow this data? It was done in a very, very thoughtful, designed way. And this is really kind of the art of doing these data features or data products in your website. So the first part I mentioned briefly, we started with desire and social proof, right? So we did some experiments in the past where we have like a year in review email where we show you people who changed jobs in the last year in your network. How many people have received one of those kind of emails? Okay. And it's interesting because you see the faces and you click on them and you engage. People love seeing faces just like they love seeing cat pictures in yesterday's keynote. And it really gets at that personal connection to your peers. And the other piece is that desire to be validated. And that taps into a fundamental emotional piece of our identity. The other key piece is having this channel, right? So to get virality, you need to connect all the dots, and you need to have all these pieces put together. And you need to have each piece of activity generate more activity, right? So each action that a user takes generates 5 more actions. And that the example of rabbit is, why do rabbits breed? Why do they have so many baby rabbits? They breed a lot. They breed quickly, and they have lots of rabbits. So that's key to understanding virality, is that you want to move more people through your system faster and have them touch more other people. So the other interesting piece, if you look at when people build features like endorsements on other sites, they've often done one or the other of those first two, but they've never done all 3 of these pieces. And the third piece is really critical, is adding this data foundation and the recommendation algorithms and leveraging all of that great text data and text mining technology. Because you can imagine if I asked you to endorse someone for Microsoft Office, and then I asked you to endorse them for Microsoft Office 95 and 96 and 97, that would not really have been as successful. So that's really critical to make this all work. So that first element, I mentioned briefly the year in review email. We infuse those kinds of elements all throughout the system, because when you, this concept of social proof, if you have a connection reach out to you and say, and the message says, congratulations, Julie endorsed you, you're more likely to engage with Julie than you are with a machine, right? With an automatic message. Similarly, when you look at your update stream in your newsfeed and you see all these other people getting endorsed, that's another type of social proof where I see that Monica is endorsed by natural language processing. Maybe I want to add that to my profile. Maybe I want to endorse her. So all of this engenders more activity. The other key element here is the viral loop, and let me give you more detail on how that works. So when someone endorses someone, and it could be on their profile. So let's say you go to Doug's profile and you endorse him for cat wrangling or cliff jumping or something. What happens is that endorsement then triggers an additional action. Similarly, if you go to someone's profile, we may prompt you with suggestions and say, hey, does Morgan know painting and creative writing? And you can endorse them there. Another way that we surface this stuff is through a very frictionless flow where you can endorse people one by one, and we combine skills and people from your network, your connections. So any of those flows will trigger then a message to the person if they don't have the skill on their profile already, and bring them back into the flow as well. And so now Morgan's been endorsed. She comes back to the site, person B. And on their profile, when they click through, it says, hey, do you want to add these skills you've been endorsed for? They add them, and then we drop them into this viral amplifier, essentially, asking, hey, do your connections know skill X, Y, or Z? And when they do that, let's say they go through 20 or 30 of these and just click, that is what really amplifies the loop, right? So that piece, this looks relatively simple, but there's a lot of thought and a lot of work and data cleaning that goes into building this. And what you really have here is a deep understanding of what skills exist, what skills people have, and then who are your strong connections that we should show and ask you to endorse. So that foundation, this all gets back to, we can't do any of this. It's kind of a chicken and egg problem, right? So if we ultimately want to build this and we want to understand reputation and relevance for specific topics, we need to first understand what those topics are, right? And this was a critical piece, was to get this data in a good state so that we can build it into all of our algorithms. The other key message on is that social tagging accelerates adoption. So what I mean by that is, if we, and I'll show some details on this in a second, if we just add a field to the profile and have people enter their skills, similarly, everybody's got this form where you're going to have to fill out, what do you think of the conference, right? What do you think of the talks? That's a lot of work. It's much better if you actually give people suggestions. You say, yes, no, right? Do you know Hadoop? Yes, no. Do you know Lucene? And so the growth of data that you'll get, obviously with recommendations, will be significantly greater. The virality, interestingly enough, without any suggestions, without that making it frictionless, we've done A/B tests, and the virality alone, just having all these elements, doesn't really get us to that billion number. It's really only by combining all of these and actually taking your recommendations and showing them to your network and getting those viral loops that really gets you to this point of 1 billion endorsements. So the way that we actually get there, so how do we structure and think about this skill data and generate all those great visualizations that we showed before? It starts with skill discovery, right? So when I came in and looked at this problem, the way that I thought about it was, coming from search, I was thinking, okay, well, these is kind of like related queries, right? So if I have all these topics, I can look at the co-occurrence of the topics that people list, and then look at the most frequent ones and start to pare down that space from millions of phrases down to a normalized set of 30,000 or 50,000 topics. And then once you have that structured data, you can start to apply other machine learning techniques like classification and inference. So skill discovery, as an example, one of my coworkers, Igor, had specialties on his profile when I started that were just a text field, and people would often list a comma-separated list of tags. So what I wanted to do is turn those into entities that we could hyperlink, right, and that we could index. So the way that the first pass was, let's just look at these co-occurring terms, and first let's build the most frequent set of phrases, then let's look at how they co-occur with each other and see if we can deduplicate and disambiguate these things. So when I say disambiguate, this is a problem. How many people have worked with disambiguation in their search applications? Okay. So the fundamental problem here is, especially even if you're in a very focused domain, like we're in the professional space, professional networking, there's a lot of diversity, and a lot of terms can mean multiple things. So in this case, angels, if I generate the co-occurring set of phrases for angels, it actually ends up being a mix of many different senses of angels. And so in Silicon Valley, you have people specializing in venture capital and angel investing, early stage companies. And then there's the SoulRetrieval people who specialize in spiritual healing, energy healing, psychic readings. And so imagine how endorsements would work if someone added venture capital, and then it asked them if they knew SoulRetrieval and psychic readings. So that would be a really bad experience. And so we need a way to apply data and algorithms to avoid that. And what you're seeing at the bottom of the screen here is a matrix of I think it's about 300 by 300 phrases that co-occur with each other. And the structure in the bottom, these two blocks, are showing that basically these two senses of angel pop out of the algorithm as coherent sets of senses of the phrase. So really what we do is do this unsupervised analysis, unsupervised clustering analysis, extract out what are the likely senses, and then for each of these, we go deeper and we build essentially a classifier once these are deduplicated. So that's the other piece, is deduplicating. It's going the other direction. Rather than taking angels and understanding that there's many different senses, you may have Ruby on Rails, ROR, Rails. People may mention different variants that mean the same thing, different synonyms, and we want to actually deduplicate those. So again, this was all, what I'm describing here in its core form was built in a short span of time to get the system moving. And the way that we approached deduplication was to actually leverage mechanical Turk to gather seed data to deduplicate these phrases. And specifically what we did was we took those sets of co-occurring phrases, that skill DNA, and we'd surface that context along with other information, like what industry does this occur in, venture capital or alternative medicine. And we'd ask workers, how many people are familiar with mechanical Turk? So for people who are not familiar, what this is a crowdsourcing platform where for pennies or small amounts of money, you can have people do micro work, small tasks. In this case, we're presenting them with that metadata, and we're asking them to find a Wikipedia page, right? So once we have that Wikipedia page, the trick is that's great training data to then understand, okay, these two phrases actually map to the same Wikipedia page. They're probably the same thing. Right? So it's not perfect, but this is, with machine learning, if you get 80% of the way there, algorithms can take over and get the rest. So that allows us to take these hundreds or thousands of variants for a particular phrase and normalize it. And this really makes all the rest of what we're going to do much easier and much more accurate. And for search folks in the room, this will also help improve recall. Right? So if you only take the dominant sense of a phrase, you're missing out on a huge amount of volume. So the next step is to actually then tag people's profiles. So we take that profile, think back to Igor, he had that text on his profile. We actually want to normalize all of that text and hyperlink it, essentially. So what we do is we have a tagger that runs over the text and leverages that data that I just mentioned, that normalized data, and emits potential skills that phrases could match. Once you do that, the way that we thought about the next step was, well, how do you tell whether it's angel investing or if it's angel healing? Well, what we do is we essentially build like a spam classifier for each topic, and those are run when the phrases are tagged. So on your profile, you may have thousands of classifiers run for each potential topic. So we call this skill inference, and really this is all done in Hadoop. So we're pre-computing for each of the entities that we understand in your profile. For example, if you work at LucidWorks or if you work at Google, that it tells us something about your identity. And we can expand that into a set of likely skills based on explicit probabilities of other people who work at Google. Similarly, if you're a software engineer or a data scientist, you would get a vector of highly likely skills. And then we're doing basically naive Bayes to combine all of those explicit probability vectors, which is all enabled by having Hadoop, to crunch through these numbers on 200 million profiles. And combine all those probability vectors and say, and then we can deduce things like, if you're an engineer at Apple, you probably know about iPhone development. So the interesting thing about that is that works to tag text that's already on your profile, but you can also infer text that isn't even on the profile, right? So in the case of Mr. Khosla here, he's a partner at Khosla Ventures. We know that he has 74 connections. And that he's in the Bay Area, and that's about it, right? So there's not a lot of information on, if you think of this as a document, there's not a lot of information there. But we can leverage his network and that metadata that we do know to infer a set of topics or skills for him using that same model minus the actual text. And so a top skill for him would be venture capital, clean tech, startups. So that's pretty powerful, and think about the way that can improve your recall, right, beyond just powering endorsements. And as another concrete example, Forbes comes out with this list of top people in venture capital, and like Mr. Khosla, they're all pretty busy, and they may not have everything filled out, all their skills. And so it turns out among the top the top 20 people, the ones that explicitly listed venture capital is a relatively small set. When we apply these algorithms, most of these people have venture capital as their top inferred skill. So rather than just infer, the other thing that I'll mention is, like, really, you can do all this great stuff on the back end, but it's really, you can get much better data if you engage your end users, right? So in this case, the first step that we did was to suggest skills to people on their profile. And we started out with no recommendations. There'd be a box that pop up that said add a few skills, and then we'd actually give them suggestions. So what do you think the difference was between these two in terms of people actually filling out this field? So how many people think there was like 10% difference? 20? 50? 100? Okay. So it was an order of magnitude difference, right? So by just giving people this frictionless flow, that's huge, right? So getting people to respond to something is very hard. Knowing a lot and personalizing and giving this data, it makes a huge difference. So that gets you so far. That got us to about, I think, 20 million people adding skills to their profile, which is huge. When I started, we rolled out the field, and there were about 300,000 people adding these. And then when we added the recommendations, that got us up to about 20 million. When the next step is, okay, we've got a whole bunch of people to add these explicitly. That improved our algorithms and our data. Now let's show those to their network and get the really engaged, active members of the community to socially tag everyone else, right? And that was through the mechanism that I talked about before, through skill endorsements and suggested endorsements. So really what we're doing is taking those algorithms and showing them to your connections. Now, so that got us to a point where this is really a flywheel of data and value that is all flowing back into the search index. And it's really these key elements of combining desire and social proof with viral loops and the data and algorithms to really get that flywheel running and really amplify what people already want to do. So now we're at a point where we have over 58 million profiles tagged with skills. So this has been kind of a long journey, but ultimately what we think this is going to do is improve search relevance, connect more people with opportunity. By flowing this data and working closely with Asif and team who are working on Lucene at LinkedIn, we think that we have a powerful combination of metadata around skills and experience and reputation that's going to connect more people with opportunity and hopefully improve everyone's lives. So thank you. So we have time for questions.
Hey, so I had a question. I just like sitting in my desk and writing programs. I'm not that, I don't care to spend too much time clicking on things inside of LinkedIn. So it seems to me that the whole system has a natural bias to people who are outgoing versus people who are introspective. I'm just wondering if you thought about that and if there's any statistical methods that you can use to weight those sorts of biases.
That's right. So that's something that we're thinking deeply about. And that's why I mentioned that it's not just the number, it's the nature of endorsements. So as an example, Doug Cutting is one of these guys who is spending a lot of his time coding. And so he may get a lot of inbound activity and a lot of people endorsing him. But he may not be actively, endorsing people back as much, right? So that's one factor. Similarly, you may have other people who are just not engaging with the system much at all. And so Mr. Khosla, who I showed before, is another great example. So we can actually understand based on other factors, right? So the fact that you work at, let's say you work at Google, right? And the team that you work with is a very notable team and is known for delivery. So I think that it's a combination, and I think Hillary hit on some of this yesterday. It's not any one signal, so just the activity isn't going to get you there, right? But it's this web of all this other information and contextual information that will help us understand the person who's not engaging with the system as much, who's busy, who's got a role that they aren't in sales, they aren't in recruiting, they aren't very actively reaching out to people as part of their job. We should still be able to understand the quality of their work. And over time, what we hope to do is create experiences where you do represent your professional activity, like for example, your commits or your project work, and use LinkedIn as a conduit for that, and it will more accurately represent that type of work as well.
Hi, I'm Patricia with Open Source Connections. I was wondering, so throughout a person's lifetime, they'll go through many different skill sets and cross many different areas. What is sort of the timeline of an endorsement? At what point does that endorsement no longer hold its value?
That's another great question. So one of I think that I'd separate it into two pieces. One is, how do we allow you to represent that on your profile? And the other one is, how can we understand that on the back end? So on the back end, on the data team, we've already been thinking about that kind of thing. And so we look at the recency, right? So based on your roles, right? So I used to do embedded software in C++, embedded engineering years ago. And if I get endorsed for that by someone that I worked with back then, maybe that's not the most relevant thing for me right now, right? And maybe there's a decay over time. I can no longer do that, right? If you sat me down and I had to do embedded engineering right now, it would take me months or years to get back up to speed. So on the back end, we can kind of tease that out in the way that I was describing. But I think these things are much easier if we build that into the way that you can represent on your identity. So one way you could imagine is if we actually allow you to tag positions with skills, or we have recommendations from coworkers, we can think about that. So I think that it's not completely fleshed out or understood how to represent that, but we are thinking about it deeply. And your set of skills is not a one-size-fits-all box that exists for all time. There really is this time element.
I had another question about Wikipedia. I just wasn't quite sure about two things. One is, how did you tag a skill with a Wikipedia entry? You actually had humans do that through Mechanical Turk. It wasn't like mining of Mechanical Turk data. Is that correct?
It's a combination. So we use what the crowdsourced Mechanical Turk workers submit as a signal, and then we apply algorithms on top of that and also look at the Wikipedia page. So things can go wrong because there are humans in the loop. And so that's another active area of development. If anyone's interested in working on this stuff, let me know because we're hiring. But that's that discovery phase and that linking and mapping is critical. There was a great question in another session talk yesterday around legal data and could you crowdsource it? And one of the real problems, and this was brought up in that session as well, was in these deep domains and with like complicated jargon and acronyms, the crowd, the cheap crowd at least, can't do as well as experts who are expensive. And with a very simple question like, is there a cat in this picture? That anybody can answer that. But to understand, leucine versus Hadoop versus, understand these different topics, that's much harder. So the answer is it's a combination, and it's an active area of development.
Is there any work on how much of the actual content of the Wikipedia pages themselves or the network of Wikipedia do you leverage in that process? So
we're not leveraging the Wikipedia Graph, the Wikipedia network at the moment. That's something. So it's kind of like a first order improvement to leverage just the topical mapping. That's something. I had a site, open source site called trendingtopics.org that was built using Hadoop and Hive. Like 4 or 5 years ago now, and that dug into leveraging that graph data. So yes, that would be a great way to improve this, and I think that gets towards like with Facebook Open Graph and what Google's doing with the knowledge graph. I think ultimately we're doing that for this economic graph, and Wikipedia, and there's a great new project from Wikipedia around making this data more accessible that you guys should check out. Thanks.
was wondering if LinkedIn is going to put something in there for the afterlife, like Google just did. So
For what? Sorry.
once you're dead, right? What happens to that data?
SoulRetrieval. That's what happens, right? We bring you back. Bring you back to the site. Yes.
So like if an active LinkedIn user like myself, when I change jobs, I go and update it. So 50 years later, you can pretty much calculate that this guy worked for 50 years, and now he's not updating. He's probably dead. At that point, you don't want to just delete my account because I recommended a bunch of people. They're gonna be orphaned. So how would you handle that?
What's that? Yeah, well, I think that was an unexpected question. Okay, so I think that's actually, I mean, that's a pretty important point, right? And we have this come up all the time, and we want to be sensitive. You have to weigh both sides of this, right? And I think it's one of our core values is members first. So our default on this is to actually, we actually do have policies and things in place for this. And our default is, it's always the member first. So even if you've endorsed a bunch of people, if you delete your account, like your data goes away, right? And so right now, if you're a state or if your family, says, okay, delete that account, then so effectively, that's a good point. I mean, over time, I have to say that I think that that this gets into the 80-20 rule. I think that the impact of that on this data over time is probably going to be diminished. To the previous question about recency, the relevance at that point is probably not as strong. But thank you. That's a great question. Okay. Are we? I think we're good to go then. Can we break early? Yeah. All right.